Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Ultimate History Podcast. Don joining you today. I have with me Dylan, Chris, and Robert. Robert is on the road today, so he's actually sort of dressed as he's in his hotel room, I guess. So he looks like the respectable one of the crew here we're all dressed, but
yeah. Point of clarification: we all do this podcast.
Point of clarification: we are all dressed.
We can only see each other
There you go.
Yeah,
there you go.
Only promises we're making.
Yeah,
I brought a
probably should go ahead.
We're
I probably should
out
go
eating
ahead.
Yeah,
I probably should go ahead and restart the recording right now and count us in again, but I'm not. This will serve as a good little blooper. So I'm gonna let Chris say hi to the good people.
Hi, good people.
All right, and we'll get rolling into this. This one I think was actually suggested by a listener. I just realized I was going to go back and look for that, but I think this came up as a listener suggestion, and it's in one of those areas where we're going to talk history here, but we're not going to talk what I call hardcore history. But it's interesting history in a corporate sense, and I think in a broader social sense in terms of what a lot of people come together. So, if A Fork in Time were a video game, what would you guys imagine that it might be? What might be the objectives? First of all, what would the main character of the A Fork in Time video game look like? Is this a Donkey Kong-esque figure? Do we have a Zelda-esque figure? What do we have in there to what would the A Fork in Time video game look like, guys?
I think this is going to be a full-fledged Paradox grand strategy unhinged mod of some sort. I don't know what era we probably like a late Renaissance all the way up through World War II, Cold War era, just unhinged grand strategy mod for something.
I love I do feel like that's interesting because Paradox does have like different like period games. So as much time as I've spent on Hearts of Iron, I think I might be Victoria by default just because of that. But like I find it really interesting that you went there. I do feel like Dr. Eric Rush has to be a first-person shooter.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
Only as a sniper shooting for political figures.
I was going to say, or as the medic from Team Fortress 2, one of the two.
Exactly. He could actually play both, depending on which mode it is and how you choose to do it. Yeah, he be the guy helping us find the health packs that we need to stay alive, or he could be again, for whoever might be listening, purely fictional reasons. He might be the guy behind the sniper rifle, and we know who the targets might be. I'm not saying Woodrow Wilson would be one of them. Just saying. That's just out there for you. The reason I bring this up is today we're going to talk about the historical what if that relates mostly to video games. That's certainly the place where we're going to be because that's where it kicks off. Or I think it has legs that go beyond that. But in the last 20, 30 years, what 4 of the top 6 video game consoles have been some flavor of Sony, right, Dylan? I think that's what you gave us in the background notes.
Yeah, it's either 3 or 4, but basically Sony has all of out of the top 6 best-selling video game consoles of all time. Sony has all the ones that aren't handheld. Is really the gist of it.
Yeah, and when we talk here, so we talk about video. Obviously, we're talking about Sony in this case is the PlayStation. PlayStation is an interesting element of this. We'll talk about how that plays into this, how PlayStation plays into this. But, of this last 25 years, certainly the Xbox from Microsoft has been out there. There have been other consoles out there as well. But if you go back to more my era and Robert's era way back in the day, we go back to the Atari 2600 being the state of the art after Pong in our very early days. And it morphed into, and then Nintendo came along really, really strong into the 80s and 90s, and Sega was in there as well. But the video game console space has been through a lot of ups and downs, is my point, over the last 50 years. It goes through cycles, it goes through technology changes, but there's sort of a watershed moment that was announced, and then wasn't. This is at the Consumer Electronics Show in May of 1991. So I was thinking about that when I was looking here. We're now going back 33 years. It's hard to believe it's been 33 years, but it has been. We're going back to the CES back in 1991. And at that point, somebody out there maybe who's better than I am what is the landscape in the video game world in 9091?
The landscape looks very much like a Conestoga wagon moving across your screen. That's the only thing I could think of from about back then. And
And everybody's going to die from
Yep.
dysentery before it's all said and done, right?
Yeah. This is the beginning of sort of this is the beginning of what's known as the fifth console generation. So you have the Super Nintendo, which is kind of Nintendo's terrible at keeping up with everybody else in terms of when the generations happen. They have to screw everything up. But right now they're in the middle of the Super Nintendo. So they're basically the at the end of the first big like jumpstart that they gave to the sort of gaming renaissance after the ET video game for whatever system it was in the mid 80s basically single-handedly almost killed the gaming industry.
That was for the Atari.
Okay. All right. So that's why I hate Atari. Now I remember.
Yeah.
So basically this is the beginning of this sort of gaming renaissance that's going to kind of go from 91 until kind of about 2000 and I don't know, maybe 2004 is kind of this real gaming heyday. And then 2004 sort of gets you into the beginnings of what led to where we are now. But this is like, if you think of a gaming sort of decade and you're late Gen Z, late Gen X, early millennial, this is the decade that we're about to get into that you're thinking of. Your Super Mario Brothers, your Donkey Kongs, some of the Final Fantasy games. This is the decade in gaming. As long as you don't care about shooters, like this is pre-Call of Duty. This is the decade in video games that we're about to get into.
And particularly here, we're talking about console games because there's this parallel course that's going on in the gaming world that is actually on the PC, where they're being run on computers that are constantly being upgraded with more intensive graphic capabilities and memory capabilities and all the parts that go with that. I'm thinking here about the games that I played. I'm a gamer, but to a degree, but I'm not consider myself a full-on gamer. But eventually by the middle 90s moving towards the late 90s, you get into the arrival of things like Doom, and you get into the arrival of things like that, where you start having also LAN environments in the PC world where you're able to get a bunch of people normally commandeering an office on a weekend, because that was the only way they could normally get that done easily, because they didn't have set up at home to play something like a multiplayer Doom type scenario or something like that, where the first person shooter is a little bit after this for the most part, I guess, with the exception maybe of GoldenEye at some point in there I think that was was that a Nintendo game? I'm trying to remember.
Yes,
Yeah,
that was Nintendo 64, which is going to be disappointing later.
PC wise, this is probably like Wolfenstein 3D.
Yeah, and you're getting into some early CRPGs. Like this is when Baldur's Gate and some of the really early computer role playing games are coming out too. It's very very different tracks between home consoles and computers. This is sort of one of those periods where never the twain shall meet. Kind of arena.
Yeah, because eventually what happens with the rise of the internet, which is why I go there, is eventually you start getting into ultimately, getting down the road to, within the last decade, for example, being the type of thing where Fortnite comes along and it's in a shared environment. You can play it on all types of consoles or all types of systems. What you're using as the local hardware sort of doesn't matter because you're tying back to something that's playing into that universe. But at this point, what I remember, there distinctly were the computer gamers and the console gamers, and they may have played both, but they were very loyal to the areas that were there. And the concept of three-dimensional high-rendered graphics, to the extent they existed, was over in the computer world, not in the console world. And consoles looked a lot more like arcade. But we're on the verge of changing that, which is why I give this background here, because we're in the period of time where technology is moving in such a way that the realization exists by Nintendo. Fair to say Nintendo is the big kid on the block at this point, without a doubt?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Super Nintendo basically puts them on the map. They're actually a former like board game company, which I still to this day find fascinating. The Nintendo Entertainment System comes out in 88 or 89, I want to say, and basically this is when Super Mario Brothers just like do takes off.
Yeah. Ooh, very nice. Very nicely done. We make that some flavor of that the actual title of the episode. But the reason I bring that up is if you were a kid asking for a video game system, your parents probably would have bought you a Nintendo system, and that's what you wanted because that was the place to be in this window right here. But the technology is coming along, graphics, computer speed capabilities, all of the other things that are there. And a big driver of what we're going to get into here is at this 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, the big thing in Vegas I've never been to that I want to go to just sometime, just because it sounds like it's a fun place to be, regardless of what they're unveiling out there. Is
live show?
Ooh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Just make sure my wife forgives me for whatever crazy fancy TV I end up buying.
Yeah, we may make that happen someday. But the big thing that's happening now at this announcement is that Nintendo and Sony have announced that they're going to partner. And one of the main reasons that they're partnering is the Nintendo system is cartridge based, and the realization is that in order to be able to do some of the things they already know they can do and want to do in the next generation video systems, you're going to have to bring some form of optical disc technology to play in order to be able to do that, to be able to have a large enough game to load, that can be stored on, at that point was basically the equivalent of a CD or, a very early version of what we think of as a DVD or what would become maybe Blu-ray, depending on which format you get into here. But Nintendo realizes that it needs a partner that can do this optical disc thing for them to go to where they're going to go. And so they end up talking about a partnership with Sony. And of course, Sony, I can remember as a kid, we owned a small Sony color TV. My dad paid an arm and a leg for compared to other TVs because it was a Sony TV. It was a quality little 13-inch color TV that we had in the RV, and it was a Sony, but there's a reason he paid what he did for that compared to other options at the time. And so Sony is a well-known name, particularly in the consumer space, particularly around televisions and stereo systems and other types of things there. But they're in their early phases of what they're doing with optical disc technology. And so the concept here is that, as I understand it, you're going to be able to take the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and you're going to be able to add on a module to it that will add CD-ROM capability. And CD-ROM is where it's at in terms of being able to have storage and the other things that are there. So when this is announced, this is a big, big deal, right, guys?
Yeah, this is huge because Sony is the big name in tech right now. The Sony Walkman was the big thing of the 80s when you could actually walk around and listen to your music without having to carry a boombox like you're John Cusack in a Sweet 16
Say
movie.
anything.
Yeah, thank you. I can remember the vibe. I can never remember that movie out of all of them. But Nintendo is the big dog in home consoles. Sony's the big dog in tech. Ironically enough, Sony actually produced the audio chip that powered all of these. I did the Super Mario jingle as a joke, but the chip that's in the Super Nintendo is a Sony proprietary product that they had produced for Nintendo. So Sony is really interested in this CD-ROM technology, optical discs. This is kind of the beginning of when CDs are coming along. And Sony also at this time happens to have a burgeoning music division. So obviously that comes into some of their considerations. They end up going to Nintendo, who's looking to find a way to incorporate this sort of CD-ROM instead of a cartridge for originally it's the Super Nintendo. And then as part of this partnership that they announce on May 28th, 1991 at CES, there's eventually going to be a console. So that's the announcement, is that Sony and Nintendo are going to make this partnership that's going to bring 3D graphics to the Super Nintendo and basically kind of develop this partnership.
And what's it going to be called? What's this new box going to be called?
So the attachment to the Super Nintendo is going to be the SNES CD, which really does not roll off the tongue, but its successor console is planned to be the Nintendo PlayStation.
Now we've heard that term before. We will hear that term later because when Sony goes in the direction of doing this on their own without Nintendo as a partner, that's where they go. And my understanding is legal things proceed from that over the name and all kinds of other things that go on from this. Because one of the things that happens in this partnership, as I understand it, is obviously to be able to partner and have these systems work together, be interoperable the way they are. You have to start sharing some things with your prospective partner here in terms of proprietary information and how you do things and where you're planning to go. And so when the partnership breaks up, that creates a little bit of an issue too, right?
Yes, Nintendo famously turns around. So Sony makes this big announcement on May 28th, and then Nintendo famously turns around May 29th and is like, "Yeah, we're going with Philips." So like they basically, you could not have left Sony in the doghouse in a rainstorm with the door to the house locked harder if you had literally served the Sony president with divorce papers. You know, that's the level of turnaround that we're talking here. And obviously, Nintendo and Sony, they try to keep it working. It doesn't work, so they never get past the prototype. Basically, this is irreparable damage to the relationship. Now, Sony ends up after the long and the short of it is Sony ends up with the sort of PlayStation branding, and they then turn around and while Nintendo is still cartridging with the Nintendo 64, they eventually do the GameCube that has the little tiny half CDs as their first CD oriented console. Sony hits the PlayStation as their CD-ROM console that comes out in I think the Christmas season of '93, and then basically it is only dethroned as the best-selling console by its successor, the PlayStation 2. Basically, right. From this point on, for 15 years, PlayStation is the number one gaming console. So the real meat of the fork is, what if Nintendo never makes that second announcement? What if the partnership continues with Sony? What does this do to the gaming landscape?
Yeah, so. And we're going to jump into that. I wanted to get a good foundation of what did happen, so that when we go into the what if the fork, it's well established here. But these were two very different types of approaches to game systems, even moving forward. I mean, for example, we this was a little bit on. We talked about this on. I asked what type of video game would it be? But if you talk to other folks, the arcade style versus the 3D rendering versus, what becomes the mantra for Sony and then the PlayStation and Xbox, which becomes its primary competitor because it's more in that genre of gaming. In fact, Nintendo almost takes an entirely different route. They almost counter program against what's going on. We can't beat that, so we're going to go in a different direction and capture a different thing and capture upon our nostalgia with all these titles that we have that people are attached to in different ways. The Mario and Zelda, all the things that are there that are there. But we end up. Nintendo is not doing first-person shooters. Sony and Xbox. Halo comes along being the primary game on the Xbox. Its premier game is the first-person shooter that it is, and then Sony and Xbox are playing it out with PlayStation and Xbox playing against each other for, again, the Call of Duties and the special, the kind of stuff that first-person shooter kind of approach. Nintendo is not even in that space.
Yeah, here's a real good understanding of it. For a while, Sony was the exclusive platform for Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah.
And imagine that on a Wii.
I don't want to imagine how some of my friends might have turned out differently if they had access to that as children.
Yes.
Let's not think about the psychopaths that we may have avoided creating.
And again, to get to your point, Chris, it was not Grand. To your point, Chris, it was not Grand Theft Mario Kart either.
No,
but that's a really good, way of understanding like very different markets.
Basically, this is the point at which Nintendo starts to kind of deviate. They keep up for a while. You've got the PlayStation versus the N64, and then the PlayStation 2 kind of versus the GameCube. But this is the beginning of that sort of divergence point where you have Nintendo starting to go off and do their own thing, where today, basically, they're the family-friendly,
right?
Primarily handheld. You can dock the Switch, but let's be honest, it's basically a super-powered Game Boy. It's primarily handheld. This is basically where they take that turn into being the family-friendly option instead of Sony and Microsoft being the like high graphic, super, like powerful. This is the beefy boys. This is what you play everything on. If you want Nintendo, you go with Nintendo.
Yeah. So again, now back to the fork as we've related to how that plays together. If there's no divergence because they're tied together in more of a partnership, then the concept is they're probably become less divergent, right? I mean, that's probably the most obvious thing about the fork, right? So you just described it there. Is it more likely then that Sony the Sony component of moving in that direction more to the realism and to the grittiness, almost taking advantage of the fact that the graphics can be gritty, becomes part of what's there for like a Grand Theft Auto or, a Call of Duty or that type of thing. Do we get more of a centrist game platform, if you will, that that has a lot more capability, or do they just become all things to all people as this sort of conglomerate that can do all types of things?
So I think there's going to be. I actually don't really think the marriage is going to last all that long anyway, just because of the nature of Sony and Nintendo as companies. I think a Nintendo PlayStation is a huge game changer in terms of, I think it's going to jumpstart a little bit earlier some of the stuff that you see in the late 90s where you start having these, bigger games. You've got more involved scripting and stuff, because one of the advantages of a CD is even if your graphical capability, through your game engine doesn't get supercharged, if you decide not to use it, from a data perspective, you can hold so much more data on a CD than you can a cartridge. So if nothing else, even if, we don't go from, a 2D side scroller to like, Fortnite, levels of or Call of Duty levels of graphical fidelity, you're still looking at games that can become much more sophisticated, branching paths, multiple endings, like you see in some of the games that Sony ends up putting out. But I still don't think, I think they maybe get one console out of it, and then Sony or Nintendo, one of them by like 1999 is going to screw this pooch.
Or do you think it's possible that Nintendo, because they started out as the board game company, they ventured into the hardware side of this? Do you think it's possible that Nintendo kind of focuses on the intellectual property of the Marios and all of those, and kind of, separates to more of the game developer software company, specializes in that versus trying to put out actual hardware?
Or does Sony try to buy Nintendo is my question. Mm-hmm. After it comes up, does Sony buy Nintendo? Do they buy them out? And then Nintendo becomes, we would have Nintendo PlayStation 3, 4, and 5, not Sony PlayStation 3, 4, and 5, because Sony would keep the brand going for Nintendo for their gaming systems.
See, I actually think it's going to be a combination of the two. So I think on the one hand, I think you're going to see Nintendo become much more of a IP focused company, like their branding of their characters, a lot like how they are today. Nintendo characters are Nintendo characters. You can sell entire game franchises like Super Smash Bros. Just based on, hey, what if all the Nintendo characters beat each other up? That sounds like a fun game.
It's almost like MCU Civil War.
Exactly.
It's very much like that.
I do think Nintendo's already got the Game Boy by this time, so I think they've seen the advantage that at least a certain level of hardware capability and portability can give them. So I imagine they're going to keep the handheld division. I think they're just going to go with a partnership with Sony on consoles, almost like how now you see Microsoft and Sony buying up all these developers and software companies specifically for the IP that they have. I think you're going to start seeing that, not necessarily the buyouts, but the licensing aspect of it much earlier than you might have seen in our timeline. Especially because, and I don't want to get too ahead of, where the conversation goes, but we also have Sega at this time, who is kind of the short third leg of the stool. They're kind of way behind Nintendo and Sony, but they're still around for another 10 years before they shift completely to software. So this is very much kind of an influx. This is the period when the system for how video games are developed for the next 20 years, this is when that Bible gets written, basically.
And the place that I went to was, I started, if that happened again, if it's short-lived versus longer-lived, it makes a difference, right? And how it stays together. To Robert's point, maybe it stays together because there's an acquisition or there's a change in the areas of focus versus just two organizations trying to do both. So Sony knows how to do the hardware technical side of the house. Nintendo knows how to create these characters that people are attached to and the intellectual property that goes with that. Yeah, I also think Disney Disney there in terms of, you
Mm-hmm.
can, whatever, you put the right character in the middle of it, and it's a cruise or it's a Disney cruise. Yes, it's still a big boat, but suddenly when it becomes a Disney cruise, it changes what it is, right?
All right,
Yeah.
I'm just pitching this. After hours at Disney World, get the kids out of the park, freaking Disney characters, just Super Smash Bros. Style, going at each other.
But the real question is Epcot still open? Have these guys been drinking their way around the world all day before the Super Smash Bros. Or what?
I am open to suggestions.
Okay,
we'll save that discussion for maybe another podcast. I don't want to get us sued into oblivion by Nintendo and Disney on this.
Yeah. or anybody else who has the legal wherewithal to come after as hard as they need to.
I do think that puts up an interesting point, though, because this is this is where all the paths start branching. Like, this is the nucleus, and everything starts spinning off from here. Nintendo being family friendly, all of it. So
does so the question I've got is, does the Nintendo Sony partnership that play out, does Microsoft go ahead and buy Sega? Because at one point they were going to, but Gates was like, we can wait. I don't think they've got enough muscle. But does this force Microsoft into, we got to get whatever we can get while we can get it, which then means Microsoft now owns all the Sega intellectual property?
I think the answer is yes. The question is just when. That's one of the
thoughts I had.
Yeah, I think it's just a question of when do they do it. I think they're going to do it, whether the Sony Nintendo partnership is short or long. I think the main part of the question is, okay, what Sega are we talking about when they buy it? If you picture, a long partnership where you're starting to talk a Nintendo PlayStation 3, in the mid-late 2000s, by then Sega's just a software company. The Dreamcast in the late 90s killed them. The Saturn was not great for them. The Genesis, which is like 1991, the first and second Mortal Kombat games, the best Sonic the Hedgehog, and I think Mega Man is their other big one, games. That's all Sega Genesis. That is all like actively happening 91, 92, 93. After that, Sega is just, kind of teetering on the edge of the cliff, and the Dreamcast they just go straight over. So if you have a Sony Nintendo partnership, I think Microsoft snaps up all the Sega games just to have some chance, because that gives them, and other than Halo, who is their IP, that gives them an IP roster that's immediately recognizable, that people can say, hey, I want to play those. I want to go buy whatever Microsoft Xbox is. If it's a short Nintendo Sony partnership, I think Microsoft buys Sega while they're still a console company, for the same reason that Nintendo and Sony partner. I think that sets up a Sega Microsoft duopoly versus a Nintendo Sony duopoly.
Especially because Microsoft doesn't have hardware people.
Yes.
They don't have people that,
Yeah. And because Sega gives, so you've got Sony partnering with Nintendo, which is, that immediately, sort of culturally speaking, I think would bring Sony more into Nintendo's camp, more to the family friendly side. Microsoft already has Halo, which is like the first big, non-GoldenEye first person shooter. Buying Sega gives them Mortal Kombat, which is the entire reason games are rated. They literally said, wait, we can't let kids play this. We have to figure out a legal reason to not let them buy it. So they came up with the ESRB rating system that, modern games use. So I think that puts you at the Microsoft, like, our edgy, hardcore, more mature, because the adults with the PCs and the Baldur's Gate RPG kind of stuff, they can migrate to that side. Sony is going to be sort of the slightly more family friendly version. I don't think they're going to be full Nintendo, but they're going to be family friendly. That, I think, is what you're going to look at in the 2000s in terms of your sort of gaming duopoly. Plus, with Nintendo as like a third head with handheld stuff.
You're going to kind of have, like, you start off on a Sony Nintendo, and When you're old, when you get your learner's permit, you graduate to a Sega Microsoft.
Yeah, and then for, if you want to do your handheld stuff, like when you're on road trips, if you want to, then you have your Game Boy with your Pokemon and some of your other stuff. I think that's too big of a juggernaut for Nintendo to split with Sony. I think they're going to spin that off as a Nintendo subsidiary that they don't have to share. But yeah, I think it's going to be sort of your Sony Nintendo. The only question, and I actually just kind of thought about this as we started bringing up the N64. The N64 is the first console that really has 4 controller connectivity. So it's the beginning of these sort of, not LAN party games where everybody hooks up their PCs together. This is your sort of like house party game console with Mario Party, Super Smash Brothers. You can get 4 people together, you can get 8 people and start doing turns and stuff. Does that happen with PlayStation? I don't know that PlayStation, they were so focused on the technological advancement. I don't know that they thought about for lack of a better word, the sort of nostalgia factor of their gaming. So I wonder if Sony focuses or stays more focused on a single player or small group experience, and Microsoft takes the mantle of sort of like, we're the big party game company, we're the multiplayer gaming arena.
Yeah, I could easily. I think that's a good point. And I could easily see that. I remember again, the first console that was beyond, in that next generation of console. I've never owned a PlayStation. Full disclosure here, I have owned an Xbox, but I remember one of the things. Even that first Xbox, you could link it together with other Xboxes. For example, with Halo. The idea then, we get enough TVs in the house, and we can do a very simple setup here, and suddenly we've got. And not only that, but you have the team aspect that comes once you add those additional controllers too. It's not just a one person against the storyline type of scenario, which has been there forever in the gaming space, in the console gaming space, or 2 players against each other, but it's 2 on 2. Or it's 4 on 4, or whatever the case might be, and that changes the dynamic. And again, that was what I think was so attractive in that span I'm talking about there, late ¡90s, moving like the Doom era of
the Quake Unreal Tournament, all of that.
Yeah, those types of things where it's like that kids are playing the consoles. We're playing this kind of thing for the reason that's there. Or I actually knew a guy that had his company he had a storefront, and it was a networked LAN storefront for computer games. You went there and you paid per hour to be able to do that, because you may not have had access to another. And Ron made some good money during that period of time doing that, because that was a place to be. Back to your point, Dylan, it probably is always the destiny. You're going to end up with some form of duopoly, just because that's the way things are going to work. You're going to have, Coke has Pepsi, you have Cola Wars, now we have console wars. Whoever's on the various sides of the console wars, whether it's Microsoft and Sony and what I think of as being, the PlayStation versus Xbox era of the console wars. At some point, you're going to have the console wars, just because that's the way it's going to work, right?
Yeah, I think once you start getting into the merger, once people realize that video games are not just it's still niche, but not like a teeny tiny niche. It's not like, rolling D20s on Pathfinder as opposed to D&D, kind of there's a super limited subset. Once you realize that it's more mainstream than you think, which happens in this time period, and once you start seeing the marriage of the original just gaming companies like Nintendo and kind of Sega with the bigger technological conglomerates like Sony, like Microsoft, I think it's just inevitable, because then it's just the technological conglomerates incorporating gaming into, it's just one of the many fronts in their sort of near future cyberpunk technological dystopia corporate war, if you really want to, phrase it like that.
Yeah. Helena would be proud of that sentence that you just uttered there, Dylan.
I didn't know where I was going when I started, but I found a way to tie it together.
Well, and where I go with that is, actually part of what brought them into this. You mentioned early on, Sony had a burgeoning music division, and so one of the things, in fact, you see it there, the Sony Entertainment. It wasn't. It didn't call it the Sony Gaming System. It was the Entertainment System, because there was already this idea that this system and all its various components sits at the heart of this home entertainment system, that has the capability, obviously, to play games, but it has the capability of playing music. It has the capability of playing movies. And we saw that, for a lot of folks.
That's actually, now that you mention it, that was one of the big reasons that's one of the reasons Sony won the Blu-ray war in the aftermath of DVDs. Microsoft had HD DVD,
right,
that they tried to put, and Sony had Blu-rays. The problem was Microsoft's Xbox 360 did not automatically play HD DVDs. You had to buy an attachment that nobody wanted to pay for. Right. Sony, Blu-ray was in the PlayStation 3. You just had it. So thereby millions of people had a Blu-ray player. That's how they did it.
And even as the first generation of DVDs were coming along, DVDs, and then the question, is it going to be HD DVD or Blu-ray? That was where it was going. Mm-hmm. I remember being someone trying to buy a system in that and trying, okay, what am I buying here that's going to be, longer term, is actually going to survive? Is it going to be which format is going to win? This is the VHS. Oh, yeah.
This is the VHS beta. Why he still has his Betamax stuff in the basement.
Exactly. And, so part of what was going on there, to your point, for a lot of folks, their DVD player or their next generation video disc player was their gaming console, when they weren't playing games. And again, this was the idea that Sony had, again, and others were concerned about it. This is the entertainment system. And by the way, how is music going to be delivered over this? Mm-hmm. And, deep, music CDs were clearly established by this point. I remember the middle '80s as we suddenly, all of us that grew up in the cassette age, that identifies me. Most of my early music library was on cassette. Now I had auto reversing cassettes and music search, so I could do a little bit of sophisticated stuff in terms of finding the track that I wanted. But obviously, when the CD player came along, that was a game changer. And then when the DVD came along, that was a game changer in the video space over VHS for all the reasons that it was. But then that next big competition was HD, as you point out, HD DVD versus Blu-ray. Who's going to win? And Sony won the higher resolution video disc because of their gaming console, not because necessarily it was a better choice to buy a dedicated Blu-ray console. Although the other benefit of a Blu-ray console, Blu-rays could play regular DVDs in them, and what adapters did you have or not have to have in the process? So is there any, again, I showed my age here a little bit, an Atari 2600, I still I still remember there's 112 different variations of Space Invaders you can play on an Atari 2600. I know that number very well because that was the game that I had. And I know that Atari tried to make a comeback here shortly after this time, trying to come back into the gaming space, and others would find their way back into this. Is there any chance that any company that we haven't mentioned here, because of the change in the duopoly or the change of the structure there, has a change? Is there hope for an Atari, or is that just this boy's dream, or is there somebody maybe that missed other than I haven't even thought of, that maybe missed the mark, that could have made progress here in a different environment?
So I'll be perfectly honest. I grew up with, the only PlayStation I didn't have was PlayStation 3. I've had every other PlayStation since. I've had most Nintendo consoles, had most of the Xboxes. Atari is my blind spot, except for a lot of their games I enjoy playing. Atari merged with Bandai, merged with Namco. Bandai Namco is now a software game developer. So I think if Atari survives, this is when it's going to happen, but I don't know in what form they would survive. Their primary attempt at a comeback in the late 90s, early 2000s was more on the software side, like Neverwinter Nights. People have heard of most. I didn't realize it was an Atari game until I literally just looked at their Wikipedia page. I think Atari becomes, in this timeline, what Sega became in our timeline, which is just earlier. I think they just become a software company. But I think Atari becomes the people that figure out what now is the MMORPG thing. I think that's Atari's niche. I think they kind of become the sort of play both sides of the fence in as much as they can, because they, I think, probably, once they see the rise of the internet, they see, hey, there's all these people that want to play games together that need the internet to do it. If Atari's going to survive, I think the MMORPG play is how they're going to do it. But I don't think there's ever going to be a hardware side of that other than maybe an attachment to a console.
Is there any other big player of the same ilk of, let's say, a Sony, that after they see this goes down, what you tend to happen is, I think this happens a lot in business. It's the Me Too thing. Oh, they've done it. We need to jump in there too because we're like them, or we need to stay. It's keeping up with the Joneses, or it's we're like them, so we can capitalize there. Is there somebody out there that when they see Sony's success in going this direction that pops up that suddenly, we're I don't know who it is. Is it Panasonic? Is it a Magnum? Is it somebody that jumps up and says we got to get into that space because we got to get into that space because we can't cede it to Sony?
This is going to sound really weird, but I promise I have a reason for this. I think it's going to be Apple, but pre-return of Steve Jobs, Apple, because the original, this is kind of a weird tangent, but I promise it comes back. Halo was not originally a PC game. Halo was originally a Mac game that Apple basically dumped when 95% of the work was finished. So Bungie, the developer, then went to Microsoft and was like, hey, can we get this over the finish line? And that is how basically Halo became a Microsoft title, is because they basically finished Apple's work for them. So I think Apple is the big, and Apple in our timeline has famously not really been a gaming focused computer company. So I think they're the big unknown that has to get figured out in this new universe. What happens with that? Did they try and jump into one of the conglomerates? Did they try and suck up Atari and use that as their sort of ace in the hole? What happens with Apple in all of this is, I think, the big question. At least that's my pick. I don't know what y'all think, but out of the like Panasonic, Philips, all of those people, I think Apple's the biggest one that could have done it and at least stuck around.
I was actually thinking about, interestingly enough, one of Apple's major competitors in a market that we haven't even thought about or discussed yet, and that's Samsung.
Ooh, a tank with a video game console in it.
I feel like there's I keep talking about hardware versus software. I do feel like there is a market for kind of what Samsung is in the mobile phone market, which is a software agnostic hardware. We've all, now we're talking about a situation where you've got a Microsoft Sega conglomerate, you've got a Nintendo Sony conglomerate that are doing the exact same thing, which is developing software and hardware together. If you have Samsung come in and stick to what they do as software agnostic, they can position themselves to play everything on one system.
Yeah, or the companion to that, and this very much plays because of what Sony has been known to do so often. It's not even just the agnostic nature of it, but open standards versus closed standards. Because Sony has, in two instances we're talking about here, Blu-ray was a Sony thing. Beta was a Sony thing. VHS actually won over Beta in some ways, but the most prominent way in terms of sales was because it was an open standard and everybody could make VHS. And if Beta was a Sony product, so Sony did it multiple times, and they sort of did it again with Blu-ray, with the difference that you were talking about there, Dylan, was they had an advantage that allowed them to leverage what they did when they did Blu-ray. They learned from their Beta mistake, I think, in that sense.
Or not to get too beating up on this, but hey, what got Apple in its trouble in the first place is because they insisted that we're going to develop all of the software for our stuff. So when I was a kid in the mid 90s, and it was a treat to go to Best Buy, you would go to Best Buy and there would be all of these games for PC, and there might be 2 or 3 for Apple, because Apple insisted on keeping everything locked in and proprietary.
Yep. to me that's one of the great, and I bring this back into other business conversations I have in my real life all the time too. There are times when being the proprietary system has tremendous benefits. There are times when the open standards wins because open standards wins, and there are wins that you can point to either way. There's no one right strategy there, but which strategy you choose makes a difference, and the timing on that strategy makes a difference. No doubt about that. So this did and didn't happen in the space of a day in 1991, and then the way it played out from here, like as I said, that's 33 years ago. That's the part that just boggles my mind a little bit right now. Well, the co-founder of this podcast was 3 months old when this happened. Let's just put that in perspective, because Alexis was born in February of 91. So let me just put this in context for us, okay? But where would we be now, I guess, is how I want to bring this around to a close as we close out here, as we're coming up on time.
So I think we would be kind of in a version of where we're at now, but I think, and when I say that, I mean the sort of gaming is kind of not, other than you sort of Nintendo's not completely walled off, but we'll call it a chain link garden, where they kind of stick to their own thing. For the most part, other than that, you've got your PC and consoles are pretty interoperable. Sony and Microsoft are, from an economic perspective, they may be competitors, but from a cultural and nostalgic perspective, they're basically they've changed from a oppositional to a sort of cooperative game. They're both kind of playing with the same goals. I think if you have a Nintendo pairing with a Sony, I think that jumpstarts that, because the reason why that happened is because as consoles became more sophisticated, they started shifting from separate underlying computer architecture to the same computer architecture. I remember the PlayStation 4 was the big one where they switched to x86, which is the same fundamental architecture that underlies Windows. Just for people who may not be super familiar with how, technological stuff, imagine that for the first time after several thousands of years, somebody decides to, it's like Cyrillic versus a Latin alphabet. Think of it like that. You have all the Romance languages that all use the Latin alphabet, but they do not communicate very well with people who speak Slavic languages with the Cyrillic alphabet, until somebody decides to create something that bridges that gap. That's what the architectural difference that we're talking about is between pre-PlayStation 4 moving to x86. That's kind of what we're talking about. So if you have a Sony that's much more technologically focused, that's underpinning a Nintendo, I think that move to a PC sort of interoperability or an intercommunicative capacity happens way earlier. That then I think starts getting you into more of the conversations we have now about, okay, what is the nature of gaming going to be with all these things on all these platforms? Just everybody trying to consume everything and communicate with everybody, all of these live service things that just constantly fight for your attention. For good or bad, I think that conversation that we're kind of having now, at least in gaming, we would have had maybe 10 years ago.
So it accelerates the process?
Yeah.
I'm interested in, I threw some references out. We haven't talked mobile at all, which is a huge part of it.
I think that's a whole other ball game that we'd have to get into.
Well, I think one of the interesting things is if you have this merger happen and Nintendo keeping their Game Boy hardware. So Nintendo kind of goes to, the console portion is handled by Sony, but they keep their mobile. Well, what about having Nintendo be the Samsung? Nintendo be the non-Apple, or Nintendo be a player in the phone market?
Well, that, or do you see somebody like Motorola partner with
Nintendo,
Microsoft and do like a because I'm thinking more of a competitive sort of focus. Do a an earlier
Ericsson, there's a ton of companies that
you start seeing a more PC, an earlier PC focused handheld attention.
Yeah, it amazes me still. I mean, I know there are plenty of games on smartphones now. Without a doubt, there's plenty of games on, but and I know that there are some that you can even sort of can do some things where you get more of like a Game Boyish kind of actual controllers versus trying to interact with the touchscreen, but we've never really seen that go full bore like it could go full bore, where literally you stick your Android or your iPhone inside of this thing that suddenly is like the Switch, in terms of now it gives you all of the specialized buttons and controls there. That's doable. I've seen things that are like that. I know there are things that attach to that, but that never really came to be in that sense for reasons that it never came to be. And if you have a different set of players who suddenly say, well, that's how we're going to morph the market to our benefit, because we can't win over there, so we're going to do this because we can win over here. That's ultimately what tends to happen. Is I think it's interesting you throw a Samsung out there, because Samsung, all of these companies in the technology space, the entertainment and gaming now, to me, are the same space. They're just different flavors of the same space with different things that are there. But Sony's had to reinvent itself. Selling that wonderful 13-inch fantastic Sony TV that my dad bought when I was a kid. That didn't pay the bills today. And they've got to keep reinventing themselves as they move forward, or they die. And so who reinvents and why? That's timing. It's part of it. Philips did get a boost off of this. Philips Magnavox did get a boost because of the decision to go back in the other direction here. We're not talking about them as much today, though. We're still talking about Sony for the reasons that we're talking about Sony in the episode today. Robert,
see,
I know you've been absorbing all this, and now you're going to impart some words of wisdom for us.
When you were going with the handheld, I'm actually thinking, and I have to get my years right, that what you're talking about, if it morphs differently, Nintendo holds on to the handheld and holds on to it. They roll the handheld adapter devices out at the same time they roll out Pokemon Go, because that was the killer app changer for iPhone games. And I remember this must have been 2014, 2015, maybe 2013. I remember sitting in a SharePoint conference meeting with a bunch of guys, and we ended up off on a total tangent. And I was talking about how Pokemon Go was going to change the world, because if you could do that, what could you do in a corporate environment with augmented reality? And don't even get me started on what I'm doing with my company now with VR and AR with XR interfaces, because it is totally different. But if they what you're looking for, Don, if Nintendo holds on to the handheld gaming piece that we're talking about, and they want to invest to do what you're talking about, that's the app that does it. Because that was the killer app. That was the killer app that almost pushed smartphones into that arena. And if you had somebody put those two pieces together, that would have done it.
Well, and I have a similar, when you go that thing that was running through my mind when I was still doing the part-time work that I was doing at Major League Baseball games, doing statistical data entry. I can remember the Pokemon Go day or whatever they had when they paraded through Minute Maid Park with the folks who were there to get the special Pokemons that day or whatever. And so you have these parents who are obviously just like, yeah, I'm here for the game, but the kids are here for the Pokemon, kind of thing. You could see them as they were walking, doing the little parade around the field. You could see various expressions. I will just leave it at that varied based upon the age of the person walking around the field, because it was like, I had to shell out this much money I'm not a baseball fan. I had to shell out this much money as a parent for this ticket because of Pokemon, was sort of the attitude that you saw on some of the faces that were there. So you're right. I think it's an interesting way that can play together. All right. Any closing thoughts here, guys? This was fun. We probably ought to circle back around to it. Some of the other things that we mentioned here, it's at the bottom of the list of all the things we're circling back around to. We got to go back and revisit Maryland. Who knows how many times we have to go back to the Clinton thing or the sheep suffrage timeline? But we'll line up and return back here to the other part of this. I think it is interesting to talk just beyond the game component, the gaming component, some of the stuff that Chris was talking about there when it comes to the hardware versus software evolution and what that would have meant. And I think it's real intriguing, Dylan, that you brought up Apple, because depending upon when Apple does other things, does Apple do the things that Apple did? That becomes part of the question. If there's no reason to bring Jobs back because you saved the company some other way, for example, does that show, do we not have an iPhone now, for example?
My question is, does Next take over the gaming part? That was the little Steve Jobs company.
Yeah, I was trying to find a way to put Pixar somehow in that because of their 3D technology.
Yeah.
My only other thing, and this is all Chris's fault because he brought up Samsung and we made a military contractor joke. I can't stop thinking of a Samsung Texas Instruments collaboration in this world before Raytheon gets spun out of TI. So my joke might actually be a reality about being able to play video games in your tank. Or shoot an actual Matthew Broderick's War Games movie would be a reality where you can actually shoot missiles from your computer.
Well, and the true reality, as you guys know, now is the use of game technology in military training, and even in the interfaces that are being used for drones and other things today is, basically, I think the military, if military were like college football recruiting, they're just as likely to be recruiting in the in the electronic gaming arena as they would be recruiting people that look like they could actually carry a rifle across a field, kind of thing. Because at the end of the day, who's winning your war? Your joystick warriors are winning the war at the end of the day these days. It's all merged together. All right, good stuff. See, we talk history, but we don't always kill presidents. See, we do other stuff. And we even venture over into video games here, and certainly I'm looking forward to hearing the feedback from our listeners on this particular episode. So we'd recommend that you go check out our Discord channel to do that, where you can give us feedback on this and tell us everything that Dylan, Chris, and Robert got wrong. I didn't get anything wrong, but you can tell them what they got wrong, and you can tell me what I got right, or give us whatever feedback that you have for us, but we certainly welcome it. So signing off for Chris, signing off from Robert, and signing off for Dylan. Thank you for joining us on this episode of A Fork in Time. Come back and see us next time, and we'll talk about something else. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.